Ministry Media Show. I'm here on the call with a friend and associate of mine called Abrie Hatting. We had a conversation a couple of weeks ago where we started delving a little bit into nostalgia, and we found out that we moved in the same circles, we were in the same places, etc. And but what I love about your story, Aubrey, is um, I like stories where you hear about heritage and people paving a way for other people. So I think what I want to do is when we get started, I want to start there and just talk about your dad and what he's done, and then how that mixed with you, and the kind of same circles that we were in. But
Okay.
before we get started, just tell us, what do you do today?
Well, today I run a IT company. Actually, I've been doing it for 30 years already, so it's not new. I mainly look after clients' networks. We are the in-house IT department, but we look after about 30 contracts on a month-by-month basis. That's our
Cool
main
stuff.
focus. Half of them being schools, and that is one of my
Wow,
passions.
that's interesting. Okay, so we know where you are now. Now we're going to go back into time. But just before we do, we are also, for those listening and watching, you might know that I am a part of an organization called BNI. So we're both directors in BNI and at different levels. And we obviously enjoy what we're doing. And that's kind of how we met.
Yeah.
And we've kind of, if I can use a picture to explain to you, we've been watching each other across the room for probably about a year or two.
Yeah, yes.
And then one day we said, let's have a one-to-one. And we connected and we started talking. And that's when I unearthed this gem of a story that I want to try and tell today.
Okay.
Aubrey, talk to me. Let's go back to, we were talking about heritage earlier and saying, you know, our so let me say this. Aubrey is obviously, he's a believer, he's of the faith, and he's a Christian, as I am. And we were using that as a start for the conversation. We were talking about
Mm.
where we came from, what we've done. And Aubrey actually said, I see this is kind of the stuff that you do, and here is how I connect to that. And I think that's kind of the story. I love reading books like the old stories where, with Catherine Kuhlman talks about how she started her ministry, and they had Radio City, or the radio program that came up, and Smith Wigglesworth, how he came up, and all of I call them origin stories, where you have these
Origin, yeah.
superheroes, and there's the origin story of where they came from, etc. And I think here is also a very special origin story. And Aubrey, what I want to do is, I don't know your dad, but I want to honor him through this storytelling today, because I think this is a story that I think a book could be written about. The kind of things that he did, because it was amazing, and no doubt the impact that he had on people while he was doing what would be considered for most people a insignificant function in the kingdom of God,
At the time,
and
especially, yeah.
just doing something that doesn't seem that important. But now, as we move in the era of media and discipleship and leadership and transference of skills and vision and knowledge, etc., what he's done for me, I think, was incredibly important. And I think if we were to be able to throw this worldwide and broadcast it to millions of people, we'll find people that would listen to this and phone in and say, hey, I actually know him, and this is what he's done for my life. And, let's put it in God's hands and see what he does with it. But I want you to go back and start with the story of, how did your dad come up, and what did he do way at the beginning that you know of?
Okay, so my father, just as a foundation, he passed away in 2007, so it's now 30 years already. Um, and his significance is still, for me, incredible. He was born again at age 16, and Pastor Billy Smook, which is my grandfather, was the preacher that led him to the Lord, and he then fell in love with Pastor Smook's daughter, which is my mom, and they eventually married. And my dad went to Bible school. Um, Actually, he went to Bible school just before they got married, and because of money and stuff, he actually dropped out after the first year and went to work for SABC. There was just radio in those days. He was a sound engineer. He worked for them for quite some time, and then when he left, he started his own business. And he
Okay,
actually,
just pause for me there. That was your dad, right, Aubrey?
no,
Okay,
George Hutton,
so I think just give his name again.
George Hutton.
George Hatting. Okay. So just anybody that's watching it now or going forward, just think about, does that ring a bell? Aubrey, I think what you just told there for me is a very significant part of it. And you know, in ministry, if we look at our effectiveness and going forward and what we're doing, that part where we are essentially tent makers, right?
Mm-hmm.
We go into an environment where we are getting paid and where I believe God's preparing us and we're learning
Totally.
skills that later on he's like, here's a deposit, here's a deposit, here's a deposit, here's a deposit, and later on it's used for amazing things. So I just wanted to mention that because you know there is this, I call it the what do I call it? I call it the montage. The moments when it's a long period of time, but when you are being developed and you're learning things, etc. But at some point in the movie, and I was saying that in quotation marks for those that listen, now it makes sense because you can see how the
How it
person
got there.
got there. Okay, please continue from that.
Well, on that note, my dad actually picked up on that around 2000. He made a statement and he said he's now realized his whole life up to that point, God has been preparing him through everything he's gone through for what he's supposed to do now. And that's when he launched the Academy of Sound Engineering. And he said he could never have done that if he had not have done all the things that was leading up to that. So his early years in the SABC, where he got hands-on experience and knowledge, he then launched his own gospel band, Impact Gospel Group. They toured the country. I was 5 to 15, so that was 75 to 85. They toured and they sang in churches all over the country. And he also did sound systems in churches. That was his big thing. Um, his impact group, he was sort of the preacher and the singer. He never completed his Bible school, but so he was a lay minister. He just went about ministering, and he always saw his career as a ministry of works. Yes, he did the job, he got paid for it, but it was actually a ministry that he was involved in. And as his son, I was the eldest. I got roped in being the gopher. Go fetch that, go do this, go do that. From age 13 onwards, I was doing all sorts of things. I remember at age 15 sitting at the back of a church in the mixing desk, and a wedding is happening, and I'm doing the sound because my dad is next door doing a funeral. And yeah, I'm left. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm following his instructions, and it worked. And that is sort of my upbringing. We were always told to do what we need to do. So for many years, he focused on sound systems. He focused on what he was good at. And in 84, he actually tended to do Rhema Church sound system. Ray McCauley was moving from the old Tony Factor building into the complex they are still in. And it was the biggest sound system at that stage in the Southern Hemisphere. And he won the tender. He did the sound system. And he moved our whole family from Benoni to Randburg because he could not find somebody to train to do the sound on a Sunday. And Ray asked him, I don't care what you do Monday to Friday, as long as Sunday the church works. I don't care if you have a private job. And he kept on doing sound systems and working on churches and stuff. But on Sunday, Rhema was what he did. I was Rhema had 16 venues, and he had staff, and I was roped in, and we just were all part of the family until the day my brother, Christo Hatting, which is currently filling my dad's shoes by far better than I could ever, was old enough. He was then 13 to start doing it. And I said to my dad, I've had enough of sound. That's not my interest. It's Christo's turn. And Christo took to it like a duck in water and has built a career around it. Still today, that's what he does. And I moved on and found IT, which is what my passion was. But my own passion crossed the paths with my father again in '88. He actually got me into IT as well. Uh, this is a fun story. He sat at Rhema, and the chorus boards in those days, 86, 87, was a projector, and you had to print the words, put it on a sheet under a light, and it was shone onto a board. And so whenever you have to change the slide, you have to physically take another sheet and put it down. And he said there must be a better way. He flew to Germany, he researched it, found a company there to give him the info, came back, found a company had to build what we were calling chorus boards, those 4-line LED boards. He found a programmer, they wrote software. And unbeknownst to me, I worked in the tape department on a Sunday. My dad did the sound, I was in the tape department. So we're both in the same booth at the back. And this one service I pitched up, and right between us, there's a computer, 88 XT. And at 512 RAM, I remember it, a 20 meg hard drive, one of those orange or amber screens as we called it. And it stood there. I'd never seen touch the computer up to that stage. And
Wow.
he got the song ready. He put it on the chorus boards, and then had to move to the mixer to change knobs. And the next verse came up, and he was too far. And I pressed the button. He gave me a look, smiled, and didn't look back. I ran the chorus board. I'd never seen a computer before. I just had a knack for it, and he knew it.
Nice.
And he pushed me into it, and that started my career in computers. And we
It's
worked as a
amazing.
team in the sound desk for the next 4 years like that.
Awesome. Aubrey, there's a couple of things that you mentioned. I want to go back, but essentially, what I think I'm hearing you say is, I think everybody, especially in Afrikaans churches, are very familiar with the koortjiebord.
Mm.
And it sounds like your dad was the founder or the creator of that.
He was. But not just that. You know what his passion was? He
Yeah.
wanted to go into churches, and we would have in the 80s called them the Dutch Reformed churches, and they were very conservative. An organ is the only instrument, and you only did
Yes.
it this way. And he
Yeah.
went in there, and he called it demo services. He spoke to the dominee, and he would pitch up with his band, and they would tone it down, not charismatic, but they would tone it down, but they would use a piano, they would use a guitar and have some drums, and they would do a service where my dad preached, the band sung, whatever, and they showed the dominee there's a better way of doing it to get people back into church. Church got boring, and that was demo services. So he installed over 6,000 sound systems in South Africa into churches over a 20-year period. And
Sure.
most of them was not charismatic churches. When we drove around with him, and you drove into a town, if we went from here to Cape Town, and you drive to all those little towns, he would see the churches, and he'll tell you, Germany this, pastor that, reverend that. He knew every
Wow.
pastor in every church as you drove from Joburg to Cape Town.
That's
And that
amazing.
was his passion in life.
So, Aubrey, I want to use that as an opportunity when we're looking at media today, and because that was really their media at that point, and embracing it as a communication tool, and kind of reviving and revolutionizing our churches. I assume that this was obviously a brand new thing. What was the rejection and the persecution like at that point? Because obviously bringing something new into this environment, there's got to be some pushback.
Yes, there was pushback. A lot of churches didn't want to embrace technology. But my dad was the ultimate diplomat. He was one of those people that didn't see a no. and he didn't argue with you, but he would give you a different point of view. And I don't know if you know much about the Dutch Reformed churches, but during the 90s, they were known for having the eredienst in the morning and the youth
Yes.
service at night. In the
Yes.
morning was just the organ, at night was the other instruments and the guitars. And he created, well, he inspired that because he did these demo services, and if they pushed back, he said to the dominee, well, let the youth do it at night and you can still look after the traditional folks in the morning. And
Yeah.
in the 90s, that's how the Dutch Reformed churches operated, almost like two totally different types of churches in the same building, morning and evening. So by the 2000s, those things started changing and they totally embraced it. But for a decade, there was a split in how they approached it, but they didn't split the church. They didn't get in trouble or anything.
Awesome. So your dad really spearheaded and what is the word? What is the word for that? Just brought something. Yeah, championed two things: the quirky board, and also what essentially would be a charismatic kind of approach to it in the Dutch Reformed churches. That obviously was much needed. I remember I was at Afrikaans Hoërseunskool, which is Affies, and right across the road from us was a Dutch Reformed church. An old church who still had the clock and they rang that and whatever. And I used to hate going to church because two things happened. Number one, I was in the hostel, so I was always hungry. So I went to church. I don't remember if we had breakfast before, but went to the church service the Sunday morning, hungry, number one, so I'm already not in a good place. And secondly, this plate comes across and I have to put money in there, which I didn't have, and that also made me feel uncomfortable. But, there's Afrikaans word, I don't know what's the English word for it. Ek het gekatkeseer in GK. And also, like most of us, got lured into that by a pretty girl. So we went to church because of that, and went through the motions, etc. And so, yeah, I think I have a reference point for what that's like. But I did go out of church a little bit for a couple of years, if it's not a decade or so. And so I didn't see that transition happen between the two, because we would literally sit, like you said, traditionally sit with the organ, they'll play that. We would have these books in front of us with the words, and we'd like sing that. And some of it would be familiar because we'd sing it at school on a Monday morning. But I think, that transition must have been amazing. Were you involved with that? Did you see that happen? What was the
I
responses
was a
like?
passenger. Um, my
Okay.
personal story is one of those strange ones. I remember having a long, deep conversation with my gran. Um, so, just for context, Pastor Smook was the very first student at Irene Bible School, which was the Full Gospel Church's own Bible school. So, he was student number one, and I grew up in the Full Gospel environment till I was 16, and we came over to Rhema. So, I didn't grow up in the Dutch Reform side. At school, I was being teased as the happy clappy, the weird one. Um, the 90% of the kids were Dutch Reform. But for I had a very stable and very good upbringing. I was involved in church not because I was forced to, because it was just who I was and what I did. I was always doing something, and for me, it was a personal journey. I never have a before I was born again story. I've been born again my whole life, but I personally gave my life to the Lord at age 9. My father was the preacher. A church somewhere in the country. Me and my mom have tried to figure out where. We cannot remember it. But my younger brother, Christo, which was 7 at the time, I was babysitting him at age 9. And when the altar call happened, I put my hand up. And because I'm sitting on the side babysitting, I wasn't noticed. And at the end of the service, my mom saw me crying. Why? And I said, well, I could put my hand up and I wasn't noticed. And she then took me through. I remember that like yesterday.
Awesome.
In the Full Gospel Church, you didn't get communion until you were 16. But I said, I want to be baptized now. So I got baptized at 10 on my own insistence, and I could then have communion. And we came to Rhema when I was 15, and I got baptized by the Holy Spirit by 16. And nowhere did I enter a rebellious stage. Right through school, into varsity, my life has just been a consistent journey. I never got into the nonsense of what some people get into. So I sat and I said to my gran, I don't have a story to tell. And she said, but you just told me your story. Be proud of what you have done and how you stuck to your decision. Why? Because in school and with people that I met, I was never tempted to rebel. I had my own conviction, and you cannot move me. In high school, and you get teased all the time, I would be in a group of friends, and two would be talking and start swearing, and notice I'm there, and they would stop and say, sorry, Aubrey. That was just who I was. You don't do this around Aubrey. He doesn't appreciate it. He doesn't join
Right.
in. That's who
Yeah.
he is. And they accepted me, and I was just steadfast. So my whole life is one of, I made decisions, I stuck to it, and I walked what I wanted to do, and I accomplished what I wanted to do. And my dad was a driving force behind that, because I saw everything he did, how determined he was. He was a very hard worker. And I appreciated him so much more in adulthood than as a child. And I've many times wished I'd spent more time with him as a youngster. He did sound systems in churches, but he would go back a week later and he would go and train them. I found a tape of him in a Dutch Reformed church training the sound engineer and the orchestra musicians, whatever you want to call them, and it's a sermon. He's talking to them about, you are contributing. Now, you're not just sitting there doing the sound. If you see
Right.
that lady is going to sing false, you do it this way, because you can't embarrass her. You can't bring the audience into the negativity. You need to keep it positive. And you need to be ready for the pastor. You cannot afford the service to be derailed because God is affected. And he says, you prepare, you belt
Mm.
and braces. So radio mics, every time the pastor stood on the stage, you better have a radio mic with a brand new battery that you put in
Yes.
and you tested. Don't take a chance with it. You plugged in the cable. You made sure this is done. You take responsibility for what you've done. He says, and one of his famous stories was that when you have done everything and something goes wrong, that's when God steps in. He says there was a sermon where the pastor did the whole service on his radio mic, and at the end, my dad takes the mic, opens it to take the battery out to throw it away, and there's
There
no
was no
battery.
battery. Mm.
There's no battery. But the
Awesome.
mic worked the whole service because my dad was so prepared and he did his thing that when something went wrong, God said, well, that's where I come in. You have done
I'll come
everything
help you
you
out.
can. Now it's my turn. And did you hear that story? Because you answered it without.
I
You
know of
call
a
me a story.
story. I know of a story that Angus Buchan tells, where they did a Mighty Men conference, and they had these big monster cables that went through to, I think, the screens that was now obviously, and the sound. And after one of those services, they went and obviously have to pick up the cable, and they realized that one of the cables was not connected. But right
But the
through the
whole
whole
thing worked.
thing, everything was playing. Yeah. So, Aubrey, having told that story, I want to ask you this, and I'm asking this because I've experienced this, and I want to see if you've experienced it or maybe you have stories of your dad. But I think when people look at the sound guy or people in charge of the media, etc., what people don't know is that we are also anointed, and we also, during that process, are led by the Holy Ghost. It's
Yes,
not just something that happens there in the front with the preacher. We also have to listen, be led, be prayed up, submitted, all those kind of things.
correct. And that was one of the things that he said. He said to the sound guy, when they are practicing on a Thursday night, you are there. You need to be part of the team. You're there when they pray at the beginning, you're there when they break up, because you are part of the team. although you are unseen, unheard, totally ignored, that's not the point. You need to be there so that when God is needed, He's there for you. And that was one of his things that he insisted. He says the whole group, from technical to the front line, had to do things together.
And I think this role, any role in media, you could be doing like producing the live stream, or you could be doing the sound or video, doing the video camera or whatever. And a lot of times, especially the sound guy, and I'm saying this because I have a lot of pastors that listen to me. The Those people are the most unappreciated and unseen people. But without them, it's not going to work. Whatever you're trying to do and achieve, it's not going to work. And I think often ministries forget that. And so I think I mentioned this to you last time. I think there should be a media appreciation day, where you just appreciate the media guys, because they play such a crucial part in the communication of your message that we know needs to be done. I want to go back a little bit. You said your dad had a gospel band. And
Yes.
this was before he started the sound company, correct?
No, it is during. So when he
During.
went into sound and he had to do his first sound system, he is a musician. My mom was the lead singer. He was part of my grandfather's church. So the actual band that ministered in the church
Yeah.
uh, was his band, and they then traveled the country. They actually
So he
stopped
had to
singing in
obviously
different churches.
learn. He had
Yeah,
to
yeah,
obviously learn how to do sound for himself and their own services.
correct. And
Hmm.
actually, there's a story I remember him telling where before he was married, he was a teenager. He built his own speaker, and he would go into the townships and he would go and preach. He built his own speaker, went there and used it. So from a teenager, he already had that inclination of using the equipment and using it for a purpose, not just for using it. And then he took that into the church. And obviously, in the church, the preacher preaching is a very small part of the sound. The band is the bigger part. So around him formed a decent band. And eventually, that band was so good and well knit, they became a touring band. At one stage, Impact touring the country was the largest gospel band in the country. They do you remember Brian Gibson?
Yeah.
Brian Gibson at one concert was the opening act for them.
Wow. Sure.
They went around. It was the late 70s, early 80s, and they toured. And then the band closed because my dad got more and more into bigger projects and bigger sound systems. And then with moving to Rama, the band also when they grew up. There's a time where you know it's the end and you call it quits. But it was one of those. I mean, I grew up my early teen years and on a bus every Sunday in a different town in a different church. It was just life for us.
So, Aubrey, is it possible if you are in ministry and you are, for instance, an itinerant minister and those kind of things, is it possible to handle a balance with that and family? Because I can hear, from what we've spoken before, and obviously in this interview, I can hear that you're very fond of your dad and you're fond of that whole experience in your life. It's not something that you despise like a PK would, because a lot of times a PK, which is a pastor's child,
Mhm.
they would despise that whole process because there was a sacrifice being made at the expense of the family. And a
Our
lot of
family,
times,
our family as a whole was so involved in the same crusade, if I can use it.
yeah,
I mean, when I was a teenager, 16, my younger brother was helping my dad with the sound. I was doing the tapes and then the chorus board. My mom was on stage singing. My dad was doing the sound. We were all involved. I mean, Sunday was work day for us all.
yeah.
Every service, not just the one, all four services, we were there. So we were very close as a family. But my dad was a very hard taskmaster. He didn't accept mediocrity. He didn't accept laziness. And when I was a teenager, me and him butted heads. I remember at age 18, I wanted out of the house. I wanted to just, that's it. My life must now start. I have now had this um, strict upbringing that I was involved with. But 2 years later, I had come around and I saw what he's accomplishing, and I saw life is actually tough, and he prepared me well, and our relationship was restored very fast. We didn't really have a split. It was just a rough 2 years, 18 to 20. But we were very close up to the day he died. Was when my fondest memory at this moment was that last day, the night before my dad passed. I was the last one to sit with him. We had a 2 hour conversation in depth where I asked questions, and he gave me recognition and inspiration. And he knew it was the last day. I knew it was the last day. We had a nice chat, and the next morning he passed away. Cancer can be terrible, but he he pushed that thing. The doctors diagnosed him in 2002 and gave him 6 months. He
Yeah.
drew that out to 5 years, and in that 5 years, do you know what he did? He had developed a curriculum to train sound engineers properly because they weren't being trained properly, and he had a deal with first Allenby campus and then Damlin campus to through them educate the students. That's 98 to 2002, and just after he was diagnosed, he cancelled the contract with Damlin and he opened his own academy where he could control it A to Z, and he got it going. And by 2007, when he passed, he had put everything in place and the people to take it further. And both my brothers are part of it still today. It's currently the largest sound engineering training academy on the continent, and I think
Wow.
maybe in the southern hemisphere. There's not a if you speak to anybody in your industry for sound, they know Academy of Sound Engineering, and if they've been around for 20 years, they know George Hatting, they know Christo Hatting. They they created what we know today as a very well trained set of people in churches. My brother Christo tells me that you can go to Nigeria and to Egypt, and in a church you'll find a student that was trained at Academy of Sound Engineering in South Africa.
Wow, that's amazing. Um, Aubrey, I want to get to the Ramos stories in a moment because I think there's a lot of things we can get out of there and tell from that. Um, just before we move on to that, let's dive into the nostalgia, a last kind of moment, and tell me what it was like. Because your walk with your dad and what you were doing with him, and just following around. What you were essentially doing is a concept we call sitting at the feet of the master, if you will. And I know we've spoken a lot about that, etc. But having sat at his feet and having done that, so such an intense experiences that you had, and you were so involved in that. What was that like, sitting at his feet and working alongside him, etc., in ministry for so many years, and just drawing from that experience? And obviously he was doing that under the anointing and through guidance, etc.
Well, my biggest embarrassment is I didn't appreciate it enough. The few times I sat still to sit and listen to him preach or talk, uh, I was amazed. My dad was a very quiet person at home. You could sit in the same room with him for an hour before the conversation starts, and if you
Yes.
wanted to talk to him, you had to sit there and wait till he was ready to speak. But put him in front of a crowd of people, I would sit there with my jaw on the floor listening to him. This what the anointing that came, and when he was eventually ordained as a minister at Rhema, but he never officially finished Bible school. He did Bible school at Irene in the 60s and never went back. and the rest was learning on the go. But what I learned from him in observation was very slow. And my own experience, he remember I told you I was very involved in the sound with him when I was very young. And when my brother was old enough, I said to my dad, that's it. Krista is now old enough, it's his turn. And my dad immediately let me stand to one side. But I looked back later and I realized how he was manipulating me and pushed me in a direction. He saw I had a talent for technology. Don't know how he saw it, but he took me to that movie War Games in 1981 when I was 10 years old. He bought me a ZX Spectrum in 1982, which is a toy, but it was a computer. And when he put that computer down for the chorus boards in 1986, he pressed one button, he stepped aside, and I took over. How did he know I was going to do that? He played me like a fiddle, and he created my career. Uh, he then got me a job at an IT company after school. And then when I had learned, I was there for 4 years, where I learned everything about IT and I was on the top of my game. I quit because I felt I needed to go into my next chapter. And my dad said, yeah, it's ready. I stepped into Rayma in 94 as head of their IT department and created their first IT system, putting them on the internet, creating their first email, putting their first server in, linking the bookshop and the wholesale and the admin and everything together. I ran it for 3 years like that and then stepped away and started the business that I'm still involved in. So my dad had a part in that from 1981, and I only discovered it in 91.
Sure.
So sitting at his feet was him preparing me subtly. And that is something I only noticed later. And I wish I could replicate that. And it is not easy, but I've sat down with my mom and I had discussions with her. And she said, yeah, she knew this, but I didn't. They were really playing me.
I know that you're a father as well, and having gone through that, let's talk a little bit about the importance of a father involving your children in what you're doing. And I'll tell you why this is a fun conversation for me, because my daughter would sit in front of in the passenger side and open up the visor with the mirror, and my son would do something similar. I don't know what he'll be using, but he'll basically they'll start talking, and then when they finish, they'll just talk like there's someone on the other side, and I'm like, who are they talking to? And then they would finish off, and they would say, and don't forget to like my video and subscribe to my channel. So what is let's speak to the importance of involving your kids in what you're busy with and using that as an exercise of, let me impart what I'm doing in your life, and you might go completely differently like you've done, but just for a father, you know, if you look at biblical examples, you'll also always see the patriarchs, etc. They always had their kids with him, walking with them, carrying wood, although they were involved in the environment, etc. How much do you appreciate that, and how important do you think it is for fathers through normal day-to-day things to hand over the heritage of faith through normal, like you said in the beginning, just normal works?
Well, you need to practice what you preach. And
Hmm.
my daughter is now 16. She turned 16 2 weeks ago. And at different stages in her life, I have involved her in things. I mean, being in IT and being computers, when she was 5, she had her first computer. Um, she knew what to do with it. She has physically built computers. When we have to build 20 or 30 computers over a weekend, she had her fair share to build herself. But I never
Wow.
pushed her beyond what she wanted. That she had no interest in the technical side. I saw that early on, so I didn't push. Um, I then cultivated the programming side, and she's now in grade 10. She is the top IT student in the school. She she's her dream board in her room. She wants to matriculate and get a scholarship to go to study at MIT.
Wow.
That's it. And that's where she's going. She wants to go and study at MIT. I said to her, "You
That's
better
amazing.
get good marks." I don't have that sort of money, but we're pushing her and we encouraging her. But now she's a strange child. She's our only child, so she had to look after herself a lot. So she has become the person that's the center of attention. When her cousins get together from 20 to 12 and she's in the middle, she's the one that's in charge. When she walks into a room at school, she's the one that focuses everything around her. She's a big fan of production drama, and she says right in the middle of the stage where they put that X, Dad, that's my spot. She wants to be the center of attention. She's a musical. She plays piano, recorder. She Her grandmother just gave her the accordion, and in one day she found YouTube videos and taught herself to play the accordion. She plays some
Amazing.
guitar. She writes her own songs. But she's an IT student. She's a math student, and she wants to be a computer programmer. She wants to write games. She's actually already registered her own gaming company. Her name
Wow.
her website is under development, and she wants to launch her own games on her website. I said to her, she's got so many things to fall back on. I'm not worried about her being a performer in the house. That's our retirement plan. We've worked our whole life on this child. One day, that's our retirement plan. There's enough options there. But I want her to do what she wants to do. If she doesn't want to be a programmer, I'm not going to push her that way. But I can see where she's got interest, so I cultivate it. I buy her software, I buy her equipment to push her closer. But if she doesn't take that step, then go the other way, and we'll cultivate that. That's why she's got the instruments. She is in the drama classes. Whatever she wants to do, she wants to sing. Let's take her to singing lessons and see if it works. She's been in the choir her whole life, so she enjoys that part of life too. She's written her own songs, and one of her dreams is actually to have an album. She's written 10 songs, and my brother Christo has got an arrangement with me. We're going to put those 10 on CD soon. We just need to find some time to do it because studies is number one. So
Yeah.
for me, it's showing her that you don't stand still, you don't walk into a wall, and you keep on experimenting to find where your heart is. Because for me, it's IT. It wasn't sound. I mean, I was the odd one out in the family. Even today, my mom, both my brothers, my dad, sound, sound, sound. That's it. And they're all into Macintosh because that's what you use in sound. And I'm the IBM guy, so the PC guy, the Windows PC guy. Total opposites to them. But that's where my heart was. And my dad cultivated that and put me on that path. So I want to do that for Rue. I want her to be who she wants to be and excel at it, but don't just be mediocre at it. If you're going to tackle something, you do it properly. Don't dial it in, really. If you're going to choose that subject, then you do well at that subject. Don't take it
Yeah.
to dial it in. That's
I
what I
believe.
believe.
I really believe in that. I've got a saying: if you give everything you've got, every time you do anything, you'll be the best.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got about 10, 15 minutes left. Let's go segue into the Rayma story a little bit, because I think there's also a lot of fun stories and things that came out of that. So in your career, did your dad start the sound company before or after he got to Rayma? And just tell me, like, how did?
Way
And the reason
before.
I want to tell the story is because I went to Rayma, I studied there, and I've got a lot of associates, and I work with a couple pastors from Rayma as well. And I
You were a
think that
decade
was an
after me.
interesting story for me. Hey,
You were a decade after me.
yes.
I did
So,
Bible school 91, 92. I think you
oh,
did
you
too.
also went there.
Yeah, 91 and 92 was my 2-year Bible school.
That's awesome. And then, so at what point did your dad get there, and
Pastor Ray basically commissioned him.
So my dad would never have gotten the Rhema contract if he wasn't already good at doing it. So he had
Right.
done thousands of churches. He was well known in the country for, if you want a church sound system, that's where you go.
Yeah.
I mean, in those years, I don't know if the same people are still there. Christian City, as it was known then, he was involved with that as well. Um, Moreletta Park is another big church that he did. Uh, I don't know all the church names. And over the years after Rhema, he even did churches in New York, in Rio de Janeiro, in Kazakhstan, in Australia, all over the world. My dad got involved in the big churches. In South Africa, small churches where he cut his teeth. And he, with his gospel band at one stage, with him preaching, with him doing sound systems and building that, and him then educating the one sound engineer or the two, and the two people that is in the orchestra or the 10, when he did that training, from the pastor to the guy that just plugged the cable in, you were all sitting down for the same lecture. He,
Awesome.
yeah, he called it Techman, Technical Ministries, and that's in those early years. That was his ministry, Techman,
Right.
and he would
Awesome.
educate people. And so when he launched ASE and he wrote the curriculum in 96, 97, that's when he said his whole life was leading up to this. He would not have had the credibility and the experience and the network of people that he knew to that moment have launched it. And he needed all of that background to be where he was to move forward. And even with his SABC connections when he started. So he started at the SABC before TV was invented, when, well, in South Africa came to fruition. When TV launched in South Africa, he actually was one of the first people that sold television sets and fixed it. He had a factory in Benoni where they were working on TVs. I remember there
Wow.
was a big ball and you would swing it and smash the tube to test it. I don't know why, but I was very, very young. It was fun swinging the ball. So Radio Vision was what he called his company in those years. And Radio Vision is the one that then got the contract to do Rhema's sound system. But that was the last job Radio Vision did, because as my dad then did Rhema, he closed his business down and then part-time he started doing sound systems again, and he called that Hatting Technologies. And Hatting Technologies was my company name I took over from my dad until 2 years ago when I renamed it now because of cloud and wanted to have a more
Right.
appropriate name. But
Yeah.
the journey he traveled through the radio and then TV and then church sound systems, from small going up to bigger things. Oh, I should have done that thing. Can I just switch this off? That was unfortunate. Sorry.
No problem.
For that. So all those background things that he had to learn. So when he got to Rhema, he had already done thousands and thousands of churches up to then. And
Wow.
that was his pivot into the bigger things. So Rhema was then the biggest he did, and he went on to do bigger after that. And his knowledge and his experience was then utilized into the education side to train people. And that's where he spent the last 10 years of his life, 95 onwards, basically on the education and imparting the knowledge into the next generation and the students that was going to go further. My brother, Christo, is probably the example you are thinking of as learning at his feet. Christo walked with my dad from 86 to 2000, literally so much in my dad's shadow that nobody said there's Christo. They all said there's George's son, George's son. And when
Yeah.
my brother in 2000 said, I'm my own person, he broke away. He moved down to Cape Town to get as far as away from my dad so that he can just become himself. And he was at, I think it's His People Church in Cape Town, where he then did their sound and built his own business. And when my dad passed away in 2007, my brother shut it down, moved up to Joburg, and stepped into my dad's shoes at
Continue
ASE,
his legacy.
and then brought his own business. Christo still today runs his own business, uh, hiring out sound equipment, doing live gigs. Um, he's a very quiet person. So for me to find out what's his next thing is you have to pull teeth to get information out of him. But I get from my mom some of the stories. But he's walked that journey. But the other side of it is he's taken my dad's education journey and kept on working with that as well. So I'm very proud of what my brothers have done with my dad's legacy. I mean, I have not contributed to my dad's legacy at all. I created my own path, but my brothers have taken my dad's legacy and expanded on it, both of them, and in the process have created their own paths. My youngest brother, George Jr., well, he was George Jr. till my dad passed away. Now he's just George. He actually was a Drakensberg's boys choir singer, choir, whatever you call them, and he's gone into marketing. So he works at ASE, he's the marketing director, and he's responsible for the growth that you've seen at the ASE over the last 10 years in what they've done. He's also one of the lecturers there. So in his own right, he's got his skills too. So they have literally taken that legacy and walked it. But they learned at my dad's feet more directly on what he did as a job. What I learned from my dad was who you are as a person, and then what you do with that and go further.
Awesome. Um, can you tell me a little bit about, I think we could possibly just touch on kind of the scale that your dad functioned at Rhema. You mentioned a lot of things that happened there. What did he implement? What did he start from scratch? What was his advice? Those kind of things.
Um, okay, so the sound system was obviously where he started, but he was in charge of the whole technical department. All the venues, anything that happened in those venues from a technical side was not just designed by him, but managed by him and planned by him. Up to about 95 or 4, that's when he then had people that he had mentored for 10 years take over from him. I think Steve LaRue was the person that replaced my father when he left. Um, and took that further. But he set up the protocols and the quality and the expectation level that was needed in the full technical department. The one exception would have been the television department. That had a life on its own because of the broadcast side, although my dad did the sound side of that, but the video department was a little bit more of a unique standalone department. Um, with their own vision and working closely with my father. That's the one he didn't run or was in charge of, but the rest of the technicals was under him, and he developed the systems. I mean, he never claimed he's the only one that can do it. He found people that were better than him and let them do it. I I saw him train people, and when they could do it, he would sit back and let them do it. And he was there to pick up the pieces or to mentor and to guide. And that's why he went into bigger and bigger sound systems, and other people did the smaller systems.
I want to just mention, I think I wanted to ask you about obviously the TV ministry that also evolved there. And you said that he wasn't really involved in that. But let's be honest, without the sound, the TV is not going to work. It basically draws its source from there. So that's a big part of that.
But it's like the
And
Sunday service. He was a supporting act to the Sunday service. Ray did the service. Ray was the star. He had the sermon, and he decided what would happen. And the TV department decided what they were going to do and how they were going to do it. And he made the technical side of the sound obviously work. But when it came to all the other aspects of the sound, that's where he then created what he needed to create for to be seamless and just work. You didn't have an expectation of a problem. the sound doesn't start by putting two speakers and they point to the crowd. In a church like Rhema, the delay factor from if you sit here or you sit there or you sit on this side, the whole way that the auditorium was designed, you needed to get the right speakers in the right place, pointing to the right thing, working together in the right way. And this was all before computers did it. My dad never had a computer run a sound
He
system.
did it on intuition and
I
yeah.
mean, Christo, my brother, can now sit with his iPhone in any seat in the church and run the sound system from there if he wants to via
That's
computer.
right, yeah.
My dad didn't have that. It was, I mean, the iPhone came out after my dad passed away. That's how long ago this happened. So he was the analog system. Obviously, some of the equipment looked quite fancy. I remember I couldn't figure out how those desks worked in the end, but he knew. But today it's computer systems. But in his day it wasn't, and he would run around that church because he needed to hear what things sound like there, and he needed to know what sound like there, and he needed to know what there, and he knew everything. And this is one of my favorite things. He would see somebody stand up and walk to the back and walk to him. Then he would say to me, "That person is coming to tell me the sound is too loud." How do you know? I've been watching him. He's not singing. Because he's not singing, it's louder for him. And I have to have it that loud because everybody around him is singing. And when you're singing, you can't hear as well. So the sound has to be at that level because they're singing. But he's not singing. So for him, it's too loud. He's coming to complain. And then the guy would come in and he would complain about the sound. That was my dad. He could see these things and he knew why you did things a certain way. The sound just needed. If you realize there's a sound system, then it's not actually that. Then you didn't do your job as well. It needed to be so seamless that you sitting there, you're listening to the band or you're listening to the preacher, and you forget there's a sound system. Then you're doing the job right.
That's awesome.
Was
so he was really, those old school masters which did everything by hearing and intuition, etc. Because technology changed. These days there's a big move into sound design in especially marketing, etc. Do you think if your dad was still alive, he would have moved into those things as well?
Probably. I mean, he did a lot of things. The original Ellis Park layout and the Wanderers layout, when they had sound system, he designed both those two sound systems. I mean, I'm not in sound, so my wording, my brother's laughing probably what I'm saying. But you would think when a concert happens, the guy sitting on this side of the stadium, he needs different speakers than when it's a rugby match, because in a rugby match the sound needs to be the same everywhere in the stadium. So you need a lot of small speakers. But when there's a concert, it's a different concept. And he had to design Ellis Park to do both. And he did.
Wow.
Those were when Louis laid that big upgrade of Ellis Park in the 90s. Was it the early 90s? I forget now. That sound system that he installed there, that was the pinnacle of sound systems in stadiums, in my opinion.
Amazing.
So he was already involved in those designs. You didn't just do something for the looks. Having speakers to look good for a concert was the silliest thing, because that's not what the speaker is there for. It's for you to hear. That's what the aim is. Today, you want to see these big rigs, and I think half the time the speakers in those rigs aren't even plugged in. They're just there because you must see them, and half of them are probably plugged in.
You think they are working, yeah. Abrie, I really think a documentary and a book should be written about your dad and his life. I don't know if someone, I've never heard this story, and I have an appreciation for it because I'm in the ministry media. Say again?
I'm amazed you never met him.
That's amazing. We maybe we did meet. But it must have been. It wasn't an engagement for sure. But I think there's definitely an opportunity here to have that story told, etc. Abrie, I appreciate your time. I thank you for sharing the story. I'm sure that
it was a pleasure for you, and you could honor your dad in this way as well, because
It was like
that's
speaking
how.
with him.
I mean, if you look at the gospel, that's how it lives on. We tell those stories and we share it with people. So I think for me it was also important just to tell the story and to honor your dad in that way, because I think that was amazing. So for those that are listening, thank you for listening to this episode. This was the story of George Hutton and the impact that he made, especially in South Africa, developing sound as a ministry and helping us communicate better. Thank you, Abrie. I appreciate it. And I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you.